And hopefully everybody can see that. And Dick, the virtual floor is yours.
Well, I should like first to thank the two senior common rooms for this invitation. I've been a member of them, as Mark has told you, for many years, and it's a privilege and a pleasure to address them. For as long as I can remember, I've had an interest in hymns. As a child, I was taken to the chapel in the little town where we lived and where my father played the organ, and I was made to sit through the service, and I liked the hymns best. Subsequently, it's been my good fortune to work on hymns for something like 30 years, the last 20 of which have given a purpose and direction to my life in retirement. I could have given you a lecture on the history of hymns, beginning with the Greek word hymnos, or hymnos, a song in praise of gods and heroes, and continuing through the earliest hymns. It would describe the earliest attempts, such as the candle lighting hymn, Phos Hilaron, which we know as Hail Gladdening Light, of his pure glory poured. And I could have continued through the monastic hymns of the Middle Ages to the German hymns of Martin Luther and others, and then would follow the hymns in English and the authors of hymns from all over the world. But I thought that this would be unhelpful in the space of 40 minutes. And so I decided to try and describe what I think is going on when we sing hymns. As we rise to sing a hymn, unless we're Lutherans, in which case we sit to sing, as we rise, we stand up and give forth sound. We make the text as we sing it, for each hymn may have a slightly different meaning for each person, depending on what he or she brings to it. And yet, as we sing, we do so in common with other people in the congregation. And I think this has a twofold effect. First, it unites us with others, even when the hymn is in the first person, as it often is. If we're singing, "My song is love unknown," or "I'll praise my Maker while I've breath," we're singing it with others, so that the I becomes a kind of we as we sing together. In the words of the German Evangelisches Gesangbuch, "Wer singt, bleibt nicht allein." Whoever sings remains not alone. Second, the process of singing takes the text off the page and into the mind and body and blood of the singer. It becomes the sound made by the mouth and the breath. It becomes what Jacques Derrida described as not grammatological, but pneumatological. It comes from the lungs and the voice, as well as the mind, and from the heart too. So hymn singing is a physical and an individual act, as well as a collective one. It exists somewhere mysteriously between the individual and the collective mode. I suspect that we all know that we can sing a hymn without much enthusiasm, while at other times we can sing a hymn full-heartedly, depending on what it is. And can we be sure that we are singing the same thing as our neighbours in the next pew? The text of a hymn, even though it may seem to be the most rigid and defined of literary forms, has, like any text, a certain instability of meaning. We can never be sure that we have it right, because when we sing, we produce our own version of it. It comes close, I think, to what Michel Foucault argued in What is an Author? Notice it's not who is an author, but what is an author. What happens in hymn singing, I suggest, is that the singer becomes not just the reader of the text, but for a moment, the producer of it. for a moment, when I sing, first slide please, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see our God. The secret of the Lord is theirs, their soul is Christ's abode. I think I reflect, well, that's very nice, though it's not me most of the time, though I wish it were. But I sing it because I recognize that it is true and that it applies to some people that I know. And here, the word which is most important in the verse is the word secret. Some people have the secret, and sometimes I think I can glimpse it. The points I am trying to make is that hymns have a way of reaching into our inner selves, and in so doing, they enrich our lives. But each of us has his or her own life, and that makes a difference to what we sing. As we do so, hymns reflect the almost endless gradations of feeling that we possess in relation to the most important things in life, the moral and spiritual decisions that we make, and the lives that we live. I begin with some verses from a poem by the American Robert Lowell, who died in 1977, who was descended from generations of Boston aristocrats, including the hymn writer James Russell Lowell, who wrote, "Once to every man and nation comes the moment to decide," which would be very appropriate on the 3rd of November. In Waking Early Sunday Morning, Robert Lowell feelingly describes the decline of religion, but is in despair at the world that is left behind when religion is gone. Next slide, please. One of the features of the religion he despairs of is its hymns. "O Bible chopped and crucified, in hymns we hear but do not read. None of the milder subtleties of grace or art will sweeten these stiff quatrains shovelled out four square. They sing of peace and preach despair, yet they gave darkness some control and left a loophole for the soul." I love that last phrase, a loophole for the soul. Losing these hymns would be part of losing a world that preserves us from meaninglessness and despair. Lowell deplores religious overconfidence, and he urges believers, metaphorically, not to sing too loud. Next slide, please. But if they stop singing, the world becomes an arid desert of unmeaning. Sing softer. But what if a new diminuendo brings no true tenderness, only restlessness, excess, the hunger for success, sanity, or self-deception? So that loophole for the soul turns out to be all important. But what about the description of hymns as those quatrains shovelled out four square? Lowell's obviously using a shorthand here for a kind of poetry he pretends not to like, although he is using it here as part of the context of the poem and making the quatrains, the hymns, stand for religion. But I hope to argue that the four square idea is capable of infinite variety and expressiveness, and of providing that loophole for the soul, which is so necessary. Lowell's "Hymns We Hear But Do Not Read" reminds us, of course, of the importance of music in the equation. If I don't say much about it, it will be because I know much more about the words than the music, but I recognize how important a good hymn tune is. For a hymn is, in the words of Roland Barthes, image, music, text. The music that the words make as they are sung is illuminated by the sound. Music can help to carry a tune, and hymns are often written to fit standing tunes. The tune Engelberg, for example, by Stanford, was used for William Walsham Howe's "For all the saints who from their labours rest," until Vaughan Williams wrote "Sine Nomine" for it. Engelberg was forgotten until the 1980s, when Fred Pratt Green wrote "When in our music God is glorified" for it, adding to the richness of the hymn corpus and reviving the tune Engelberg. But first, we have to acknowledge that some hymn writers have seen themselves as fulfilling a need that may conflict with their deepest emotions and instincts as poets. Modestly, perhaps, they see themselves as journeymen and women rather than as poets. Here are two examples. The metaphors are generally sunk to the level of vulgar capacities. I have endeavoured to make the sense plain and obvious. If the verse appears so gentle and flowing as to incur the censure of feebleness, I may honestly affirm that sometimes it has cost me labour to make it so. Some of the beauties of poesy are neglected and some wilfully defaced. I have thrown out the lines that were too sonorous and have given an allay to the verse, lest a more exalted turn of thought or language should darken or disturb the devotion of the weakest souls. That's Isaac Watts. And if they want the bathroom there, they can have it there. That's Fred Pratt Green. Watts had written a book of poems, Horae Lyricae, which included a poem called The Adventurous Muse, in which he celebrated a poetry that was inspired. "Give me the chariot," he exclaims, anticipating William Blake's "Give me my chariot of fire" by almost a century. Now, he says, I'm going to restrain myself. Pratt Green was thinking of himself as a commissioned person working for a client as an architect or a designer might do, but both of them do so in the service of religion itself. From this deliberate placing of themselves as servi servorum, I'm going to suggest that the hymn form is capable of producing works of art that are magnificent, as well as some that are banal. An example from Watts himself would be "O God, our help in ages past," and "When I survey the wondrous cross." One reason for this I found in the writings of James Montgomery, one of the great hymn writers of the early 19th century, the author of such hymns as "Hail to the Lord's Anointed." A hymn must have a beginning, middle, and end. There should be a manifest gradation in the thoughts, and their mutual dependence should be so perceptible that they could not be transposed without injuring the unity of the piece, every line carrying forward the connection, and every verse adding a well-proportioned limb to a symmetrical body. Montgomery was quoting Aristotle from the Poetics, a beginning, a middle, and an end. I remember thinking when I first read Aristotle as an undergraduate that this seemed to me to be the most obvious thing in the world. Of course, a poem or a play must have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It was only later that I realized what Aristotle was talking about. Greek drama was, as he put it, taken from the stories of a few families, stories of their lives through the generations. Oedipus Rex, for example, has its origins way back in the far-off legend of Laius, who abuses the laws of hospitality, and even before then. Various consequences follow, but Sophocles chooses to enter the story at the moment when Oedipus is at his most successful. He has solved the riddle of the Sphinx and saved the city of Thebes, and the play ends with Oedipus discovering that he has killed his father and married his mother, and he is cast out and humiliated. Where the drama begins and where it ends is crucial. What I think happens in the hymn world is that the writer has so much to choose from. He or she has the whole Bible for a start. The writer can begin the hymn with Jacob wrestling with the angel from Genesis chapter 32, verse 24, as Charles Wesley does in Come, O Thou Traveller Unknown, which retells the story and interprets it as a metaphor for the spiritual life. Come, O thou traveller unknown, whom still I hold, but cannot see. My company before is gone, and I am left alone with thee. With thee all night I mean to stay, and wrestle till the break of day. The wrestler struggles with his adversary. He discovers that the opponent's name is Love, and the wrestler is given a new name. Jacob becomes Israel. He is changed for life. Or a writer like Timothy Dudley Smith, who was given an honorary degree by Durham in 2009, can write Faithful Vigil Ended, about Simeon, the elderly priest in the temple, who has the Christ child brought to him and who says the Nunc Dimittis, Lord, now letteth now thy servant depart in peace, according to thy word. Faithful vigil ended, watching, waiting, cease. Master, grant your servant his discharge in peace. All the Spirit promised, all the Father willed, now these eyes behold it, perfectly fulfilled. This your great deliverance sets your people free. Christ their light uplifted, all the nations see. Christ your people's glory, watching, doubting, cease. Grant to us, your servants, our discharge in peace. Dudley Smith's commentary enters the Gospel of St. Luke at chapter 2, verse 29, and he leaves it at verse 32. It's a poem written about an old man, which is perhaps why I like it. It brings out in an imaginative way what the Gospel says. It allows us to feel the old priest's emotion and also to see what it might mean for him. We might also notice the beautiful use of the 6-5-6-5 meter. It's such a simple form, yet so right when it is properly used. I think of other examples, such as now the day is over, night is drawing nigh, which the poet W.H. Auden was so fond of. Just seeing those verses there on the page encourages a kind of quiet reverence. It's so different from the emotion that we come across when we start on a hymn with a rousing meter, such as mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. In the present case, we might want to observe how the language operates on our mind, unobtrusively and perhaps unconsciously. That word vigil in the first line, for example, transports us into a world in which we are keeping watch for something, being vigilant for something that we are waiting for or that we expect. The word vigil has a special religious meaning to do with the day preceding a holy day, but here I think it has a wider connotation. It makes Simeon's life into a vigil, waiting for the moment when the Christ child will come. That word is wonderfully rich in its significance. So too is the word discharge. This is a word that exists in multiple contexts: work, legal, medical, military, but a discharge in peace is beautifully transferred during the hymn from Simeon to us. Waiting ceases and doubting ceases. If our waiting and doubting cease, that is, if we come to find Christ for ourselves, we can find, says Timothy Dudley Smith, we can find our discharge. Discharge from what? From the ultimate cares and anxieties of human life, from the endless waiting and hoping for a life without purpose, from what Lowell called restlessness. These are examples of the way in which a hymn can begin and end. In between, there is the middle, and here Montgomery can help us again. The reader should know when the strain is complete and be satisfied. As at the close of an air in music, while defects and superfluities should be felt by him as annoyances in whatever part they might occur. Montgomery helps us to understand that a good hymn is made up of words within a line and lines within a verse and verses within a hymn. When these work well, they probably remain unnoticed. Take the opening verse of Abide with me. Abide with me. Fast falls the eventide. The darkness deepens. Lord, with me abide. When other helpers fail and comforts flee, help of the helpless, oh, abide with me. The crucial words, abide with me, begin and end the verse. And in the first two lines, fast falls is succeeded by darkness deepens, setting up a formal alliterative pattern. The pattern continues at the end of line 2, when abide with me becomes with me abide, setting up a kind of chiasmus in the verse. The alliteration is picked up again in help of the helpless. The mechanics of the writing alert us, oh, so subtly, to the way in which this is a poem to express someone's deepest feelings and not prose. I happen to have a weakness for polysyllabic words in a hymn line. Jerusalem the golden. My mind lingers happily over every syllable of Jerusalem, as it does over conjubilant with song. And there let it for thy glory burn with inextinguishable blaze. I thought of another example. After I had given the slide to Mark, our God contracted to a span, incomprehensively made man. That and inextinguishable are examples of the way in which an 8-syllable line is dominated by a 6-syllable word. And inextinguishable gives time for you to think about the way in which the fire should never go out, as it says in Leviticus, the text from which Charles Wesley took this verse. And incomprehensibly means that you have time to ponder and contemplate the great mystery of the incarnation. I've spent time on these words because it is through the words that the imagination functions. The best description of this, in my view, comes in the first chapter of the prophet Ezekiel, when he sees the chariot and reflects that, quote, the spirit of the living creature was in the wheels. Verses 20, and it comes again in verse 21. Similarly, Coleridge saw that the words were more than just words. The truths and the symbols that represent them move in conjunction and form the living chariot that bears up for us the throne of the divine humanity. If the middle of a hymn is important with these words, then so is the end. In Charles Wesley's O Thou Who Camest from Above, the last verse begins with an unexpected but brilliant trochee, rather than the iambic pattern set by the rest of the hymn. Ready for all thy perfect will, my acts of faith and love repeat, till death thy endless mercies seal, and make the sacrifice complete. That word complete is multiple in its meanings. Life is complete as God seals the endless mercies of allowing us to live. And death is the final mercy. And the acts of faith and love are complete. And, of course, the verse, the hymn, is complete. These, I think, are matters of technique. The most important element, however, I would argue, is the ability of some hymns to rouse the imagination. Poetry itself predisposes us to use our imaginative faculties. Think of that verse in When I Survey the Wondrous Cross. See from his head, his hands, his feet, sorrow and love flow mingled down. Did e'er such love and sorrow meet, or thorns compose so rich a crown? For a moment, Watts brings alive the implications of the word survey from line 1. When I survey Christ on the cross, what do I see? I see from his head, his hands and his feet, there flows down, trickling down his body, the streams of blood and water transformed into sorrow and love, love and sorrow. Sorrow for the state of the world, love for the human beings who have made it what it is. We find ourselves in our imaginations standing and witnessing a dreadful act, the suffering of the Saviour of the world. Coleridge described this process as creative and being either primary or secondary. The primary imagination I hold to be the living power and prime agent of all human perception, and as a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. The secondary imagination I consider as an echo of the former, coexisting with the conscious will, yet still as identical with the primary in the kind of its agency, and differing only in degree and in the mode of its operation. It dissolves, diffuses, dissipates in order to recreate. Or where this process is rendered impossible, yet still, at all events, it struggles to idealize and to unify. it is essentially vital, even as all objects are essentially fixed and dead. Fancy, on the contrary, has no other counters to play with, but fixities and definites. Coleridge was distinguishing between fancy, which just involves putting one thing beside another, the cat has a tail, and imagination. In Johnson's dictionary, fancy and imagination were regarded as synonyms, but Coleridge is saying that the mind is creative, even as God's mind was creative. And this goes back to what I said at the beginning about how we produce the hymn in our imagination as we sing it. Perhaps the best way I can describe dissolves, diffuses, and dissipates in order to recreate is by using another example from the great hymn writer Charles Wesley. Christ, whose glory fills the skies, Christ the true, the only light, Sun of righteousness, arise, triumph o'er the shades of night. Dayspring from on high, be near, day star in my heart appear. That hymn blends numerous biblical allusions to create an imaginative impression of the presence of Christ in the heart of the believer. In the process, it does just what Coleridge says. The first line gives us God's glory, which we find everywhere where there is light, for in the second line, Christ is the light of the world, a metaphor from many examples in the New Testament, such as St. John's Gospel, chapter 8, verse 12, where Jesus says, I am the light of the world. The Sun of Righteousness in line 3 is from Micah chapter 4, verse 2, and the shades of night come from all the references to darkness that are used as metaphors for a life without hope or faith or belief, the kind of life that Robert Lower was trying to escape from by singing hymns in that earlier example. The dayspring from on high is, of course, from St. Luke's Gospel, the Benedictus of Zachariah, when he was filled with the Holy Ghost and found his tongue again, whereby the dayspring from on high hath visited us. And the day star is from 2 Peter 1, chapter 1, verse 19, which may have been the origin of the whole hymn. Ye do well that ye take heed, as unto a light that shineth in a dark place, until the day dawn and the day star arise in your hearts. The whole seems to me to be a magnificent assembly of references that build up to bring before us what Coleridge called the throne of the divine humanity, by dissolving and dissipating the quotations that come from the various elements of the Old and New Testament. And they exist in this wonderful mixture in which line follows line, in allowing you to build up this sense of what is wonderful in your own imagination. Hymns that are familiar to us have their own life within us, as great poetry does. In addition, they give us a loophole for the soul, as Lowell put it. And on certain great occasions, they can have a very powerful effect. They can transcend the normal effect that poetry or prose has on us. An Australian scholar of hymns, now alas dead, so that I can't ask him where he got it from, quoted from a report of the Lambeth Conference of 1888. At a service in St. Paul's Cathedral, the congregation sang, "The Church's one foundation is Jesus Christ our Lord." And many of the singers reported that strange things began to happen as they sang. It made them feel weak at the knees. Their legs trembled, and they really felt as though they were going to collapse. One can imagine the scene. The great cathedral, the bishops assembled from all over the world at a time when travel was very slow, the common inheritance of hymns ancient and modern, which had recently seen a second edition, the whole display of the high tide of late 19th century Anglicanism. The combination of words and music that we call a hymn has a power, like the greatest moments in opera, to move the singers in unexpected but extraordinary ways. And that seems to me to be one of the functions of the human imagination, to participate in that kind of experience. I end by stressing the great variety of hymns. It is probably almost impossible to do justice to a literary form that is so versatile that it can contain the crispness of a hymn, such as God of Mercy, God of Grace. Next slide, please. Show the brightness of thy face by Henry Francis Light, where everything is neat and tidy. God of Mercy, God of Grace, show the brightness of thy face. And the expansiveness of a hymn by the American John White Chadwick, Eternal Ruler of the Ceaseless Round, written for the Harvard graduation during the Civil War in 1864. Eternal Ruler of the ceaseless round, of circling planets singing on their way, Guide of the nations, from the night profound into the glory of the perfect day. Rule in our hearts that we may ever be guided and strengthened and upheld by thee. You notice how each of these two-line units are separate. They run on the ceaseless round of circling planets, the night profound into the glory. And it's so different from the precision of God of mercy, God of grace, show the brightness of thy face. And it emphasizes for me the immense and wonderful variety that the imagination can cope with in the singing of hymns. I think that through the ages, hymn writers come to form a kind of senior common room in the great college of religion, a high table in which the great writers of the past sit. St. Ambrose and Venantius Fortunatus, Peter Abelard and St. Thomas Aquinas, Martin Luther and Martin Rinkart, Isaac Watts and Charles Wesley, James Montgomery and Henry Francis Light, John Mason Neale and Cecil Francis Alexander. From time to time, they are joined by others. In the 20th and 21st century, I think of one or two others, Percy Dearmer perhaps, Cyril Argentine Allington, former Dean of Durham, and Timothy Dudley Smith, as some of those who would be welcome to take their places at the great table among them. Here are a few of those who are there already. On the left is Christian Furchtekott Gellert, author of Jesus lebt mit ihm auch ich, which is translated as Jesus lives, thy terrors now. Behind him is Martin Luther, who needs no introduction, as they say, and down below with the black glasses is Fanny Crosby, Blessed Assurance, Jesus is mine. The grey figure, because he was always suffering from ill health, is Isaac Watts. And next to him, behind, is Charles Albert Tindley, the Prince of Preachers, the son of slaves and the Prince of Preachers, who began life as the caretaker of a church in Philadelphia and ended up, after study and much hard work, as the minister of the same church which he had once swept with his broom. Then there is Charles Wesley, and beside him the blonde Darlene Check, the creator of the Hillsong movement in Australia. The bearded man is William Henry Monk, the music editor of Hymns Ancient and Modern. Behind him, with the clerical collar, is Bishop Timothy Dudley Smith. Fred Pratt Green, with holding the book next to him, and Cecil Frances Alexander, of All Things Bright and Beautiful, and There is a Green Hill Far Away. And on the right, finally, John Mason Neale, the author of Jerusalem, the translator of Jerusalem, the Golden, and many other great Latin and Greek hymns in the 19th century. I shall stop there, but I thought it would be nice for you to see what at least a few of them looked like. Thank you very much for the courtesy of your attention.
Dick, thank you so much. One of the unsatisfactory things about the electronic format is that it's impossible to have a round of applause, a collective round of applause. But I think you can maybe see some of the pictures of people applauding. So you can have a silent virtual round of applause. Thank you so much. How do people feel? Should I stop the recording and we take some questions offline, as it were, or shall I leave it running?
You probably need to unmute everybody, Mark.
Yes, that's right. I'll tell you what, I think maybe in case anybody's concerned about privacy, I'll stop the recording at this stage.